Chapter 4. The year I turned 13 marked the beginning of a new century, and gradually I noticed a change happening in myself. I started growing up. I stopped hunting as much and started hanging out more in the trading center, socializing and meeting new people. Gilbert was usually with me, along with Jeffrey and a few others. We'd go there and play endless rounds of Baywo, a game that's very popular in Malawi and East Africa. The object is to capture your opponent's front row of marbles and prohibit him from moving. Baywo requires a lot of strategy and quick thinking. I'll admit I was pretty good at this game and would often beat the other boys at the trading center, a small revenge since most of them had benched me in soccer when we were younger. If I never got Mangalomera, at least I had Baywo. Each time I left for the trading center to see my friends, Combo would perk up and try to follow me. He missed our trips together, but I forbade him to tag along. People would think I was backwards for walking with a dog. One time, Combo followed me to the trading center without my realizing he was there. When I got to the fig tree near the barber shop where we played Baywo, someone pointed and laughed. "Why do you need this dog behind you?" they said. "I don't see any rabbits or birds around. Are you going to hunt in the market?" The other boys started laughing too. It was embarrassing. After that, whenever Combo tried to follow, I had to get mean. I cursed and shouted, but of course, he never listened. After a few meters, I had to pick up a small stone and hurl it towards his head. "Now leave me alone!" After a few times, he got the message. He'd still come to the trading center on his own, usually during July mating season when the female dogs were in heat and roaming the villages. He'd see me and gallop over, wagging his long tail. I'd always stop him short. "Get!" I'd shout, kicking the dust to scare him before anyone saw me. Also, as I got older, the day-to-day fate of the MTL nomads no longer determined my moods or emotions. Throughout my life, the nomads had been more than men. I listened to every game on Radio 1 and imagined them as giants. When the nomads lost, especially to big bullets, I became so upset I couldn't even eat supper, not even if my mother served chicken, and I loved chicken. This following had become an obsession. During a game that year with big bullets, my heart started beating so quickly I was convinced I was dying. I think they're called anxiety attacks. I thought, what am I doing to myself? Soccer is too stressful for my health. After that, I sort of stopped following the game altogether. Around this same time, Jeffrey and I started taking apart some old radios to see what was inside, and we began figuring out how they worked so we could fix them. In Malawi and most parts of Africa that don't have electricity for television, the radio is our only connection to the world outside the village. In most places you go, whether it's the deepest bush or the busy streets of the city, you'll see people listening to small handheld radios. You'll hear Malawian reggae or American rhythm and blues from Radio 2 in Blantyre, or Chichewa gospel choirs and church sermons from Lilongwe. Ever since the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation began, around the time of independence, Malawians have thought of their radios like members of their families. My father talked about the early days of NBC and hearing Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers from America, and the wonderful sounds of Robert Fumilani. Back then, agriculture programs were very popular, and my father remembers President Banda, Farmer Number One, reminding everyone to clear fields, dig ridges, and plant before the rains, saying that doing so would make Malawians happy and successful. He also reminded people to apply manure. And for me, growing up, I'll always remember listening to the Sunday sermons of Shadrach Wame from the Church of Central Africa Presbyterian in Lilongwe, followed by the Sunday Top 20. Unfortunately, until a few years ago, there were only two radio stations, Radio 1 and Radio 2, that were both operated by the government. This greatly reduced our window into the outside world. From the first time I heard the sounds coming from the radio, I wanted to know what was going on inside. I'd stare at the exposed circuit boards and wonder what all those loose wires did, why they were different colors, and where they all went. How did these wires and bits of plastic make it possible for a DJ in Blantyre to be speaking here in my home? How could music be playing in one end of the dial while the preacher spoke on the other? Who'd arranged them this way? And how did this person learn such wonderful knowledge? Through nothing more than trial and error, we discovered that the white noise was caused by the integrated circuit board, the biggest piece, which contains all the wires and bits of plastic. Connected to the integrated circuit are little things that look like beams. These are transistors, and they control the power that moves through the radio into the speakers. Jeffrey and I learned this by disconnecting one transistor and hearing the volume greatly reduce. We didn't own a proper soldering iron, so to perform repairs on the circuit boards, we heated a thick wire over the kitchen fire until it became red hot, then used it to fuse the metal joints together. We also learned how the radio picks up each band, such as FM, AM, and shortwave. To receive AM, the radio has an internal antenna because its waves are long, but in order to receive FM, the antenna must be outside and reach into the air to catch the smaller, more narrow waves. Just like light, if FM waves hit something like a tall tree or building, they're blocked. Since we learned everything through experimenting, a great many radios were sacrificed for our knowledge. I think we had one radio from each aunt and uncle and neighbor, and a giant tangle of wires we kept in a box in Jeffrey's room. But after we learned from our mistakes, people began bringing us their broken radios and asking us to fix them. Soon, we had our own little business. We operated out of Jeffrey's small bedroom, located just behind his mother's house. There, we waited for customers, the floor below us strewn with heaps of wires, circuit boards, motors, shattered radio casings, and unidentifiable bits of metal and plastic that appeared along the way. Our usual exchange with clientele went something like this. "Odie, Odie," someone said, standing at the door. It was an old man from the next village, hiding his radio in his armpit like a chicken. "Come in," I said. "I heard someone here fixes radios." "Yes, that would be me, my colleague, Mr. Jeffrey. What's the problem?" "But you're so young. How could this be?" "You mustn't doubt us. Tell me the problem." "I can't find the station. It won't listen." "Let me see. Yes, I think we can manage. You'll have it before supper." "Make it before 6. It's Saturday, and I have my theater dramas." Sure. We were going to determine what was broken in the radios. We needed a power source. With no electricity, this meant batteries. But batteries were expensive, and Jeffrey and I didn't earn enough from our repairs to keep buying them. Instead, we'd walk to the trading center and look for used cells that had been tossed into the waste bin. We'd collect maybe 5 or 6, along with an empty carton of Shake Shake booze. Even after all these years, I was still finding uses for these stinking cartons. First, we'd test the battery to see if any juice was left in it. We'd attach 2 wires to the positive and negative ends and connect them to a torch bulb. The brighter the bulb, the stronger the battery. Next, we'd flatten the Shake Shake carton and roll it into a tube, then stack the batteries inside, making sure the positives and negatives face the same direction. Then, we'd run wires from each end of the stack to the positive and negative heads inside the radio, where the batteries normally go. Together, this stack of dead batteries usually contained enough juice to power a radio. Of course, success also depended on the brand of batteries and what they'd been used for. Handheld radios use very little power, so they often drain a battery of its last drop, while cassette players require such a high voltage that a battery can't maintain it and fails, even though it leaves a bit of juice. The worst batteries, but unfortunately the most common, were the Chinese-made Tiger heads that died after several hours in any player. That's why we got so excited when we came across a beloved Malawian Sun battery, which were by far the strongest and powered our radios like none other. "Mr. Jeffrey, how lucky we are to have found a good Malawian Sun." "You're right, Mr. Man. We'll get plenty of time out of this one." Often, while we fixed our radios, people would approach us and say, "Look at the little scientists. Keep it up, boys, and one day you'll have a good job." I'd become very interested in how things worked, yet never thought of this as science. In addition to radios, I'd also become fascinated by how cars worked, especially how petrol operated an engine. How does this happen? I thought. Well, that's easy to find out. Just ask someone with a car. I stopped the truckers in the trading center and asked them, what makes this truck move? How does your engine work? But no one could tell me. They'd just smile and shake their heads. Really, how can you drive a truck and not know how it works? Even my father, who I assumed knew everything, said, the fuel burns and releases fire, and, well, I'm not really sure. Compact disc players were just getting popular in the trading center, and these fascinated me even more. I'd watch people insert the shiny plate into their radios and hear music. How did they put the sound on that? I'd ask. Who cares? Most people would answer. Although the people in the trading center were content to simply enjoy these things without explanation, these questions constantly filled my mind. If solving such mysteries was the job of a scientist, then a scientist is exactly what I wanted to become. At the time, I attended Wind Bay Primary School, located a kilometer down the wooded pass past Gilbert's house. The following year, I'd sit for my leaving certificate examination. If I passed, I would advance to secondary school, where I heard students had more extended lessons in science and were even assigned experiments to conduct. To me, being a scientist was worlds better than farming, which by then had started taking up a large part of my time. My father was still growing a bit of tobacco to sell at auction, but our main crop was always maize, or chimanga, which fed our family year-round. Most Malawians were sustenance farmers who depended on their maize plots to survive. If you weren't able to get food from anywhere else, at least you had grain in storage and your family could eat. Even people who lived in the city relied on their brother or nephew in the village to tend a plot of maize for them. Everyone needed this during the growing season when grain prices were high in the markets. In Malawi, we eat maize with every meal, and most families serve this in the form of dough-like porridge called sima, pronounced like sema. Sema is made by adding maize flour to hot, but not boiling, water until it becomes too thick to stir, then scooping it into cakes about the size of American hamburger patties. Tearing off a piece, you roll the sema into a ball in your palm, then use it to scoop up your relish, usually beans or leafy greens such as mustards, rape, or pumpkin leaves, whichever happens to be in season. If your family is fortunate, maybe you also have some goat or chicken. My favorite is dried fish with tomatoes. Everyone from fat politicians to the dogs and cats depends on Sema to live. Each night after our supper, Combo would be waiting by his food bowl to get his delicious helping. Most of the time he didn't even chew his portion, just inhaled it whole. How can you even enjoy it? I'd asked. Sema isn't just an important part of our diet. Our bodies depend on it the same way fish need water. If a foreigner invites a Malawian to supper and serves him plates of steak and pasta and chocolate cake for dessert, but no sema, he'll go home and tell his brothers and sisters there was no food there, only steak and pasta. I hope tonight I can sleep. Farming chimanga is a family activity that requires the help of every man, woman, and child who is old enough to work. Young girls usually help a bit with planting, weeding, and harvesting, but mostly they assist their mothers with the many chores around the home, such as fetching water, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of little ones. In Malawi, a woman's contribution is often overlooked. By the time I was 12 years old, I had 5 sisters and no brothers, which meant I was the one who helped my father in the fields. Work begins in July to clear the land from the previous harvest in May. We had to collect the dry maize stalks, stack them into heaps called chikuze, and line them up in rows. Once the chikuze were properly arranged, I'd set them on fire and wait. Grasshoppers make their homes in these stacks, and once the stalks start burning, the grasshoppers fly out by the hundreds and are easy to catch. I'd throw them in sugar bags, then take them home to roast over the fire with salt. I'm telling you, I can eat huge amounts of sema with crunchy grasshoppers. Of course, I wasn't supposed to be hunting grasshoppers while working, but we have a saying: when you go to see the lake, you also see the hippos. We spend much of August through November digging new dirt rows or ridges. Taking a hoe, I'd hack apart the two existing ridges and form a new one in the center. This was our way of rotating the soil. Since this was our dry season, the soil was hard and required my full strength to break it apart, leaving large blisters on my hands. Not only that, but the hard soil left lumps that had to be crushed using the handle of the hoe, which added to the time this took. Soft soil allowed the seeds to pass through with no problem. Some farmers were lazy and left these lumps, and as a result their yields were smaller. Making ridges was always done while the sun was boiling in the sky. It was so hot I'd work in the mornings before school, then return in the evenings before dark. If the moon was full and bright, I'd wake up at 4 a.m. before the cock even crowed. In the still dark of the morning, I stumbled into the latrine with my torch, trying not to notice the spiders on the ceiling with their black and white legs and giant hairy bodies, or the cockroaches flickering their antennae in the light, as if telling me, "This is our time to play. You should be in bed." In that quiet time of morning, you could even hear the termites eating the walls, which always sounded like someone walking outside in the grass. Back at the house, I'd draw a bucket of water from the shallow well behind our house and wash my face. It wasn't potable. By then, my mother would be up preparing a bowl of maize porridge known as fala. After quickly devouring this, I headed down the trail with my hoe, dragging behind. "Make sure you watch where you throw that hoe in the dark," my father would call out. "I don't want you cutting off your foot." "For sure." Chopping your foot is a common accident during the clearing and planting season. You'll often see children with plastic sugar bags or newspapers wrapped around their feet with twine, some form of makeshift bandage, to keep away the flies and soil. This doesn't work, however, since you're back out in the fields the next morning. Cuts don't always heal properly during this time, and every Malawian who's ever grown up in a village has his own trail of scars to prove it. E- Even with the moon, the road was dark and filled with shadows. I walked quickly and focused on each step, trying not to imagine the Gule Wamkulu watching from the trees, or bald men on witch planes flying overhead. No matter where I am or how old I get, these things will always scare me at 4 a.m. One morning while walking, a hyena cried from the bush, "Ooh-wee!" practically causing me to jump out of my trousers. I've never ran so fast in my life. Normally, the rains arrive by the first week of December and continue through March. The first sign of rain is our signal to begin planting. It's like the starting pistol in the race against God. The moment He says, "Go." When the first rains fall, you must be ready. One person will take the hoe and move quickly down the ridges, making small gashes in the soil for planting stations, while another follows and drops the 3 seeds inside, then covers them with soil and a lot of good wishes. The fields in December are thick and muddy, and stick like cakes against your feet. After a few days of rain, the seedlings will push through the soil and unfold their tiny leaves. 2 weeks later, if the rain is still good, then we carefully apply the first round of fertilizer, because each seedling requires love and attention like any living thing if it's going to grow up strong. Making planting stations was my favorite job because I didn't have to wait on anyone in front, allowing me to knock off early and go fry maize, which in December is a rare pleasure. From May through September, you're still benefiting from the harvest. The maize is abundant and every meal is grand. That is our winter in the southern hemisphere, and on those cold evenings we'll all gather around a fire and roast maize in a flat pan, laughing, telling stories, and humming good songs. But come the December planting season, most families are beginning to run low on maize, so any opportunity to sit with cousins and friends and fry maize is a treat. The smell of it roasting is heavenly and makes us all very happy. Also, during this time of scarcity, every meal of Sema is eaten with a heavy heart. December is when people must buy fertilizer and seed, which is expensive and exhausts their savings. Most people will save up enough to buy a chicken and some rice on Christmas and New Year's, but afterwards there's nothing. Come January, most people are forced to tighten their belts and wait until harvest. Outside, it's always raining morning and night, and even the birds have nothing to eat because everything's too busy growing. It's a time of heat and mud and waiting. We call this period the hungry season. In the countryside, people are working the hardest they work all year to prepare their fields, but doing so with the least amount of food. Understandably, they grow thin, slow, and weak. Children sometimes die. The hungry season has always been with us, as predictable as the cock in the morning sun. But if all goes well, the steady rains of December and January will have allowed the seedlings to grow, and by now they should reach my father's knees. The small ears of maize then begin to form, and after some weeks they reveal their blossoms, a cluster of silky hair and a tall tassel flower. By February the stalk is thick and strong and as high as my father's chest. By harvest time in May, especially with fertilizer, the stalks can be well over his head. The maize is then left to dry on the vine, then pulled and plucked. The grain is stored in 50-kilogram bags in a small storage room next to where my parents sleep. In a good year, the bags will rise to the ceiling and spill into the corridor. This is how we normally planted and harvested each year. But in December of 2000, everything went wrong. The rains were late and didn't begin until the last week of December. The first showers gave seedlings confidence to finally push through the soil, so farmers applied their fertilizer and hoped for the best. But the rains that followed were much too heavy, falling day and night for a whole week. Great floods swept across the country, carrying away homes and livestock, along with the seedlings that had just begun to grow. Fortunately, there was no flooding in our district, but the rain still washed away the fertilizer and any hopes of high yields. But like us, many farmers hadn't been able to purchase fertilizer anyway. As a result of the new president's policies, a bag of NPK fertilizer consisting of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium now costs 3,000 kwacha. It was far too expensive to buy once, let alone twice if the rains washed away the first round. After the floods, the president went on Radio 1 and vowed to assist every farmer with starter packs that contained 2 kilos of maize seed and 5 kilos of fertilizer. The starter packs had been implemented back in 1998 and 1999 and given to every farmer in Malawi who needed one. Those years the rains had been good, and with the additional seed and fertilizer from the packs, the yields had been high. But due to pressure from international donors, the program had been slashed to about 1 million farmers. So it was nice to hear the president promising to broaden this assistance. But a month passed and nothing happened. A government list then appeared in the trading center of those who received packs. My father's name was missing, along with that of many others. But this hardly mattered. By then it had stopped raining altogether. After the floods, the rain simply vanished, and a period of drought cursed the land. Each day the sun rose hot in the sky and showed no mercy on the young seedlings that had survived. By February the stalks were withered and hunched towards the ground like an old woman sweeping the dirt. A bit of rain in March saved us from total disaster and allowed the stalks to mature, but just barely. By May the sun had burned half the crop. The stalks that survived were so stunted they only reached my father's chest. One afternoon I walked out into the fields with my father, and we looked out across this destruction. The maize leaves looked like onions, brown and brittle, and ready to crumble to the touch. We were thinking the same thing, but I said it first. "What will happen to us next year, Papa?" He let out a sigh. "I don't know, but at least we're not alone. It's happening to everyone." My father was right. In many parts of the country, the yields were far smaller. Droughts hurt the smaller villages the most, since the tiny farms had to feed large families year-round. The slightest problem in weather, fertilizer, or seed productivity could tip these families off the edge into hunger. That year, the drought would be felt for several more seasons. As for our own farm, we managed to fill only 5 sacks of grain that barely filled one corner of the storage room. One night before bed, I saw a lamp flickering inside and found my father there alone, staring at the sacks as if he'd just asked them a question. Whatever they told him, I'd find out soon enough.